Yes, first of all, I would like to thank all of the community members and the administrators and teachers, PSE, staff. We really have been handed an opportunity for us to be very positive because we do believe that our legislators really had a good intent to amply provide educational funding this session. What we're going to hear tonight is kind of the reality. So this is a formula and this is our idea, and then what does it actually look like for Eatonville School District? So what are the perhaps unintended consequences, the unintended outcomes, and positive, negatives, all of those. So tonight is just really a first blush of what it actually means. Now we know that in the news, when you hear something, it may or may not be accurate, right? And so when we hear from the news or the legislators really do feel that they have amply provided 7.8 billion, right?
7.3 billion.
7.3 billion. That's why Cal is here, to keep me straight and narrow. That tells the public, oh my gosh, you know what? This is all new funding. This is all new money. What you're going to hear tonight is the actuality of what the legislators passed. And so now we are kind of handed an opportunity for us to have some really deep discussions as we too kind of pick apart the puzzle. And I really want to kind of put this out there that we really are going into this with a positive intent to see what is in order for us to be able to plan what can be. Because we in Eatonville School District have been very fortunate that we have a very high graduation rate, the highest really ever. I want to say, I don't see my high school principal here, it's 95.7%, that's unofficial, and will be firmed up, but that is a really, really high graduation rate. And the wonderful thing is, for every child that doesn't graduate, we have a story. There is a story why, and that is our responsibility as a collective body for our staff to be able to tell the school board that. We have had a very active school board. We have met with legislators. We are probably one of the very few school districts that actually have been able to sit down with our legislators and talk about what is. What we know right now, what is, what we think is. And so to help us do that this evening, we thought long and hard about the smartest person that we could get in the room, which would not be me. It would not be me. So we are really super, super fortunate to have Cal Brodie. It's kind of like having the rock star, but you guys don't know that. In the house, and Cal is the CFO of ESD 113, and for community members there are 8 ESDs?
9 ESDs in state.
9. See, that's why he's here, to correct me. So there's 9. ESD 113 is housed in the Olympia area. And we actually go down there and get a lot of our services and our professional development there. But before then, and I know Cal's going to tell you where he's from, but before then he worked for OSPI, which is the state agency for the educational system, and was a CFO there. So if you're talking numbers and implications of legislative actions, Cal is the man, and we are so fortunate to have you tonight. So thank you for being here. So let's give it up for Cal.
So I was told there's a spot I have to stand, and I see myself on the stair. So I guess I'm on the screen up there. Format. Am I addressing the board, the entire audience? Do you have any questions from everybody, or do I turn my back on them? What's your pleasure?
I'm face the masses.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll kind of bridge the gap here. So just to give you a little bit more of my bio, I was in public accounting for about 10 years. After that, I went to the state auditor's office in Washington State. And I enjoyed working there for about 5 years, and one of my specialties was school districts. And I worked both up in Seattle and then down in Tacoma. And I had the pleasure in the mid-90s of auditing Eatonville School District for 2 years when Linda Ames was still here. So I have a fondness for Eatonville. I'm not sure I would do this to a lot of districts, but Eatonville I will always answer your call because of that. After the auditor's office, I had the pleasure of going over to OSPI. And OSPI, for those of you who do not know, is the state superintendent of instruction, the elected official. And they're charged, among many other duties, with providing all the state funding for public education in Washington State. and it also flows through all the federal funding, so we do a lot of work around there. And I started out as an enrollment supervisor and had so much fun. My boss left, and out of self-preservation, like many of us do, I said, I'll take his job and apply for it. And they actually picked me, which was poor decision-making on their part again. So I had the pleasure of being 10 years in a role that was described as Director of School Apportionment, Financial Services, and at the end, Education Funding Reform. I shortened it down to say I was the state funding official for public education for 10 years. If you're familiar with what has happened over the years, in 2011, we instituted something called the prototypical school model, which was something that I had worked with legislative staff, with researchers, with my peers and colleagues, and I stayed at OSPI the last 2 years heading up a large team of people who rebuilt all the systems for the prototypical model. So I have some depth in this area. I was not the CFO. I didn't correct you that time. I'll let you get away with one for a minute. But I had the more fun job. I got to be the guy who dealt with all the districts in the state. I was the guy they called about everything. I was the guy they yelled at when they didn't like things, and that was part of the job, and that was part of the fun some days. So tonight, I just want to kind of go over 2242. It's a major piece of legislation, and there are many, many different stories out there about what 2242 is and what it isn't. There are conflicting stories, there are conflicting spreadsheets, and I'll tell you right now, they're all correct. And you have to wait till the end until I just tell you why they're all correct and why you need to dig deeper on every single one of them. Okay? So with that, I'll jump into this, if I can. Here we go. So you're all familiar with the McCleary lawsuit? Okay? It started back in 2005. 12 years later, we're finally seeing the funding that was attempted to get there. The McCleary lawsuit basically was a lawsuit against the state saying you're failing to meet the constitutional obligation, the paramount duty of the state, to fully and amply fund public education, K-12 education. Okay? And the subtenet of that was the state was relying upon local levies to fully fund their obligation for market salaries for school district staff. Okay? So over the years, we've had many conversations about that. They dragged their heels quite a bit. You may have known they were paying $100,000 a day fines because they hadn't adopted a funding formula. They hadn't adopted changes. They couldn't meet the court requirements. Last June, in the very end of session, in a very non-transparent fashion, editorial comment here, they adopted 2242. And that was their solution to the whole McCleary lawsuit. They walked out of town, they said, we did it. We have fully funded education, we can go home. And like every drunk the next morning, maybe several weeks later, they woke up and said, what did we do last night? Because they really thought they had solved the problem. $7.3 billion is a heck of a lot of money, probably the most money they've ever put into anything. And I tried to get the superintendents to chant every one time saying 7.3. They stared at me very stonily and thought I was crazy. But it's a tremendous amount of money and a good reason for the legislature to be proud. So the issue is not with the funding level they provided, it's with all the information behind that funding level. And the kind of the nuances and kind of the geeky type of stuff on how it's put together that creates some issues and some refinements that we're going to have to go through in the next several sessions as we lobby for differences and improvements and technical corrections. So where do you go here? So what did 2242 do? Okay, just a short list here. It fundamentally changes K-12 education. And it does it in an interesting way because it doesn't change the basic ed funding formula, which was the prototypical model. To simplify it, as you go through the staffing that the state provides, they look at your enrollment, and based upon your enrollment at certain ratios, they'll come up with a number of state-funded units, and they'll fund those using a funding formula. Okay, that's still intact, almost. We'll talk about one of those changes. The next piece, it implements changes in each of the next 4 years. This was not $7.3 billion, where do I deliver the check? This was a promissory note over the next 4 years on how they're going to get to $7.3 billion. It increases the state schools tax. And this is a communication issue that school districts are going to struggle with because people are going to be faced with an 81 cents increase, at least an 81 cents increase starting in 2018. And technically, that money's not going to school districts at all. It's going to the state, and the state is banking that as a 1-year advance before they start actually funding school districts with that money. Yet all of your taxpayers, all of you individually, will see that 81 cents increase. And I say 81 cents increase, there's a technical change they do county by county to adjust that tax rate to ensure that they're getting 81 cents on the true market value of the property, not necessarily the assessment levels. And that's we won't go too far on that. So you may be 85 cents, I don't know exactly what it would be for Eatonville and Pierce County in general. Okay. It decreases local levies. Local levies in the past have been based on a very complicated formula. It was 28% of the prior year's state and federal money. Okay? And there were other technical pieces that will just stop there. They blew the whole thing up. It no longer works that way. It's a very simple formula we'll walk through here tonight. There's more state funding driven through increased salary allocations. So we're finally seeing the states starting to put into a funding formula a more appropriate funding level for the compensation that the classified staff and the certificate instructional staff and the administrative staff are receiving. They're finally stepping up to what they should have been doing all along. But there's problems with that as well. And there's more funding driven through as restricted or categorical allocations. And that's a little bit of the problem. Because when we talk about the 8.3, excuse me, 7 point, you have me already. 7.3, all of you correct me when I say it wrong, please. When you talk about the $7.3 billion, this isn't a pot of money sitting on a table to be decided how you're going to spend it among schools or your share of it among your school. This is money dedicated to expansion of several programs you do. And it's very positive funding because it's improving the programs that focus on students that need help beyond the basic ed program. So your learning assistance program, which are kids that are performing below standards. Special ed program for kids who have an IEP service. Highly capable for the kids who just need additional things there. There's bilingual, and I'm probably missing other CTEs, another one for career technical. But all of those categorical money are dedicated to those programs and can't be used beyond those programs at the district discretion. So it's a little bit of a lockbox of funding that's coming out there. And that's problematic, because all of a sudden the 7.3, you start looking at it, and you start chipping away at it, and pretty soon, it's only, I don't know, $2 billion, $3 billion, depending on which math you use. So let's go through some detail on this. Okay? So, can I get you all to share 7? You all okay. The piece to keep in mind, and I do this somewhat lightly when I put this up here, because it's $7.3 billion over 4 years. It's a promissory note. It's not actual funding. It's going to show up on day one. But because of the change in the local levy, once this is fully implemented, statewide districts will be receiving $1 billion less a year in local levies. So if you just do simple math on this, which is a little improper, but we'll play the game anyways, 7.3 over 4 years minus $1 billion times 4 years means the increase now is only $3.3 billion. It's hardly worth writing a check for anymore. Okay? But it's a lot less than what the newspapers have reported. And it's interesting how many legislators didn't understand that the 7.3 wasn't all new money for the districts. It was an increase in state funding that was offsetting reductions in the local taxes and the local levies that eventually will happen. Okay. So let's just kind of run through some things. I'm not going to go detailed formulas here, but just general concepts. When we talk about basic ed staff, the biggest increase they made was focusing on the staffing ratios for kindergarten to the 3rd grade. And they focused on a class size of 17. And that's in place for this school year now. And for this school year, a district does not have to demonstrate that they actually staff at that level yet. Next year they will. So for this year, there's a little bit of ability for a district to do something with that money. Next year it locks down. They're going to have to spend that money demonstrating that they actually hired instructional staff for K-3, or they will not receive the money. Okay? As we go through there, we talk about categorical program improvements. Not too much detail, but special ed currently is funded up to 12.7% of the basic ed enrollment. Okay? It's now increased to 13.5% of the basic ed enrollment. So what does that mean? For every 100 students currently, you'll get funded up to 12.7 students for special ed if you've identified them and you have a valid IEP for them. And in the new future, that'll be increased to 13.5%. So a small increase. It's still a big problem. Special ed is a program that has never fully been funded and continues to have to be fed by local levy dollars, even in this new funding future. When we talk about LAP, getting a little wonky here, but there's a complex formula that says You're going to look at the percentage of kids that are in that program, and you're going to assign them so many hours a week, and based on the aggregate hours per week, there's a staff unit that's calculated for that, for the state funds. So they're just increasing the time for kids to the 2.3975. Yes, that's really the number. And the only way they come up with this number is they say, I want to spend X amount, and somebody has to run a spreadsheet in the background saying, you know, that works out to 2.39754294.7, and they say, if you round it up to here, it's going to cost you $10,000, and that's where they go. It's not a science. It is just how much they want to put into funding formulas. When you talk about bilingual, it's going to increase the hours that are in the funding formula for providing services to the bilingual students as well. Highly capable. Currently, your highly capable program provides funding based upon 2.314% of the kids in your district. That's now going to increase to 5%. Many people would argue, if you look at the bell curve of where most things seem to be distributed, highly capable really should be up around 12.7%, because it's the other side of the bell curve from special education, possibly. One way of looking at it. So we're making improvements. We're still not where we should be on that. CTE, it lowers the class size. I think I have that backwards. From, oh yeah, it lowers the class size down to 23. So there's an improvement to CTE funding. But the other piece is, currently the district is allowed to take indirects off the program. And those indirects pay for principals, superintendents, and a lot of the costs that run the entire district. It's the supporting cost for the teachers in the classroom. And they've come along and they said it's no longer 15%, it's going to be 5%, which means the district now has to scramble to find funding to take care of their central services, because that never is adequately funded. So it's an interesting piece where they're taking money away from the district in some sense, but it's putting more in program, but it's a financial issue that the district has to address. Okay. That's a categorical program. All of those areas, those funding improvements, must be spent in those programs. And if the district doesn't spend all the money in those programs, they first have a carryover to the next year, and then if they continue to not spend it, the state takes the money back. So this is not discretionary money. This is not money for the district to do what they want with. This is very targeted, I'd say somewhat jealous money to the program, because if you don't spend it on what they said you have to spend it on, they'll take it back. Okay? And over the 4 years in the categorical programs, this funding aggregates to a little bit over $1 billion statewide. A big piece of what they did. So I think I covered this. Yes. So levy and LEA. Levy and LEA historically has been a complicated formula. If you look at the report that comes out of OSPI to calculate what a district can collect for levy, it's 4 or 5 pages. And I tell everybody it's a really simple report to read. You just need to close your door, turn off your phone, and spend 20 minutes to half an hour, and you almost will understand it, and then call me with your questions. It's a complicated thing. It took me many, many years to simplify the pattern on how to describe it before I could address it to folks. And I'm somewhat pleased to see that it's gone away with the new funding formula. And let's talk about what that is. So we talked about state property tax will increase roughly $2.70 on average statewide. Local results will vary, and that's an increase of 81 cents. That is not coming to the school district. When we talk about the new levy, it's now referred to as an enrichment levy, and there's restrictions about how it can be spent. Okay? But the formula breaks down very simply, and if you'll play along with me, there are 3 numbers you have to remember to understand the new levy formula. The first one is the district can assess a maximum of $1.50 per thousand across the entire tax base. Okay? $1.50 per thousand. No one in the state can charge more than that. The second piece is if that $1.50 per thousand generates more than $2,500 per student, you get limited to $2,500 per student. So for Eatonville, I don't think you come close to $2,500. The likelihood is you'll go to the full $1.50, and you'll get something less, and I think we have it later in the slides. When you talk about Seattle and property-rich areas, they may charge 80 cents per thousand, and they'll get the full $2,500. So we still have a tax inequity, or maybe a resource inequity around the districts. I would say that it's improved, but others would argue with me. And the last piece is there's something called local effort assistance, which is on the bottom. And that's $1,500. So if you assess $1.50 against your tax base and it doesn't raise at least $1,500 per student, the state will backfill the difference. so that you'll get at least $1,500 per student. Okay? It's a simple thing. So the new world is $1.50 maximum tax rate, $2,500 maximum amount per student, and if your $1.50 generates less than $1,500, the state will make up the difference to $1,500 per student. So it's a much simpler formula. I don't think it had the right values in it, and many of my peers would agree with me, and we have lots of robust conversations on what we think the value should be, but the formula is much simpler and much easier to understand as we move forward. There's one last line I want to address in there, or two lines actually. So they changed the name of it. Historically, you've had maintenance and operation levies, and now they're going to be enrichment levies. And with that title change comes restrictions on how you can spend it. We'll go over some of those. But the other piece is the way the legislation is written, starting with tax collections, ballot measures for tax collections starting 2019. The literal reading of the law says you have to go to OSPI with a plan to get approved before you can get voters. You can go to the voters and ask for their approval to assess that tax. Somehow the legal minds looked at this and said that doesn't go into place until the fall of 2018. So if you're doing a levy in February, you get to escape that what I call the mother may I, this first round. But what you don't get to escape is starting in 2019, you're going to have to separate all your local levy dollars and create a separate accounting structure to show what you received and what you spent it on. And that expands out way beyond just local levies. The entire school accounting system gets blown up to the point that every dollar you spent, you have to trace back to the source of the funds that you spent on it. It's a huge level of detail that I have many editorial comments on, but I won't go there tonight. Thank you very much. They're not kind, by the way. I think I've covered that and stuff on. There we go. So a lot of these areas we're going to talk about in this bill tonight will require OSPI to adopt rules. And to tell you what the legal structure, how it works, is the legislature passes laws for something called the Revised Code of Washington, or RCW. That's the highest level of law we have in Washington state. When you have agencies of the state that have to administer these laws, many times they have to delve down deeper than what's in the law. And they have to adopt something called rules on how they're going to define further what the legislature did not. And those are called WACs, Washington Administrative Code. They're still law, but they're lesser level law. They tend to be the more operational side of what we in school districts need to know to actually work through some of these funding formulas. So as I go through here tonight, OSPI has not adopted rules. Some of the comments I make tonight will be my opinion based upon my experience, and I could be flat out wrong. I concede that. But nonetheless, we have to start the conversation somewhere. And those rules may not be available for several months before we actually know how they will define things. And that can be problematic as we try to project things out and figure out what they meant. Go on. So the levy requirements, now enrichment levies. Beginning September 1st, 2019, these enrichment levies may only be used solely to enrich the state's statutory program of basic education, as authorized under Section 501. It's kind of a lofty phrase, and you'd read this and think, so where's basic ed defined? Because if I know what the definition is, I know what everything else I can spend it on is. And literally, you won't find a verbiage definition of basic education anywhere. As best as we have right now is we have a funding formula. The legislature funded it. Within that funding formula, they designated where the money was being generated and roughly how it would be spent. That's their definition of basic education. So we have endless discussions among my peers, school district superintendents, and others in the system about what does this enrichment look like, what is allowable under that enrichment, and what will stop being acceptable for local levies. And we don't have a solid answer. We just have community consensus sometimes, or louder voices in the room sometimes. So that's a problem as we go forward, defining how we can use that money. To go down farther, within 2242, they actually provide quite a bit of language around this. They say first is local revenues, levies, can only be used for documented and demonstrated enrichment of the basic ed program. And largely where this conversation comes up is when we talk about supplemental or tri-contracts, because that's a very problematic area for all of us. We want to make sure our teachers are treated fairly, but we also want to meet the law. And it's a problem about how do we transition from what we have in place now versus where that'll go in the future. And WA has opinions on that. OSPI has largely not said many opinions yet. Many of us have opinions on it. And it's going to be probably one of the thornier things to transition among the school district employee relationship. So have patience with that, please. When we talk about enrichment, we go on. So they say enrichment activities are permitted under this section if they provide supplementation beyond the state minimum instruction offerings. So the state requires you to do 6 hours a day in high school, and you choose to have a 7th period. That, by definition, the cost of that would be considered enrichment. When we talk about staff ratio or program components, if the state's funding you 55 teachers, and you choose to hire 60 for the basic ed program, those additional teachers should be enrichment to the basic ed program, simply by definition. But this is my opinion at this point. This is not what the rules are. To me, it's pretty simple, and I'll be shocked if they do something different, but they've surprised me before. Okay? We talk about additional staff to do class size reductions. So if you're being funded a class size of 23, and you choose to have a smaller class size, you may have a cost involved in that, whether it be class size buy-downs for teachers, what you have. Program components, if you're providing certain pieces of program that aren't in basic ed, and I'm not sure what that would be, but that's what's in the language. And then program and professional learning beyond that allocated. So under 2242, they are finally stepping back up to where they were 10 years ago and providing 3 learning improvement days for teachers. Finally, we're getting state funding for their 3 learning improvement days, but they rolled that out over 3 years. And I think it was 2006, 2005, when they rolled back what they previously had provided as 3 learning improvement days. So it only took them 10 years to see the wisdom of what they should be doing and the fallacy of what they did. I do have editorial comments. And I know this is being recorded, so. And we go on to listing of what's in the law. It says extracurricular activities. The state has never funded extracurricular activities. Just by definition, they will always, always, always be enrichment. Additional course offerings, a version of what we said before. Any activities associated with early learning programs are considered to be enrichment. The state does not provide early learning programs through the K-12 budget, and they don't include it as part of the basic ed program. So therefore, anything you do in pre-kindergarten would be technically allowed to be enrichment. And any additional salary costs attributable to the provision or administration of the enrichment activities allowed under this subsection. It's a mouthful. And we don't really know how that's going to go. There's been many definitions. We thought we understood it. We went to OSPI, went to legislators, and it just became nobody was really clear on what they were expecting when they wrote that in the law. So this is when you wake up the next day from a big drinking, what did we do last night? I think this is one of those sections. What did we mean by that? Nobody seems to know. And OSPI approved areas in pre-ballot approval process. So if you submit a plan to OSPI in the fall of 2008 or on some future levy beyond that, you can ask for different things. And as long as OSPI says, yeah, that's going to be approved your petition, away you go. You're included in enrichment. I wouldn't get your hopes up high, but you never know what's going to happen. Okay. So what does that mean to Eatonville? So I've done a projection statewide based upon the 2017 levies that has not been received well by some because it's a different picture of what happens than what other projections are out there. OSPI, starting in 2000, started creating projections for school districts based upon legislature. Okay? It's myself and a colleague who created that and supported it for 13 years before I left OSPI. They have a wonderful projection model that goes out 4 years, but it presents a different picture than what's presented here. And let me define why this is different. When you talk about future, you have a lot of factors that go into it, and a lot of factors you can't control, whether it be inflation, changes in assessed valuation, what kids show up in your district, the composition as special ed versus others, or simply the varying number of kids. And OSPI attempted to do all these future projections in their models. And they're good, solid projections, but you need to understand what's in them, and as administrators of the district, you need to either buy into their assumptions or make your own assumptions. They may not come true. Okay? What I did was just simply a static comparison. And it may be a worst case scenario when you look at this. But on the left side, you look under the existing formula. I told you it's 28%. The assessed valuation is $1.3 billion. Okay? Your total levy potentially could be $4.8 million. That's per student amount roughly is about $26.88. It might be slightly different, maybe used a different enrollment number. And your tax rate on that would be about $3.94 per thousand. Okay? Because that under the current levy formula, that would qualify for local effort assistance for the state funding. You would get almost $750,000 additional in local effort assistance. So overall, from levy and LEA, the district would receive potentially 5.7. I'm looking to make sure I'm not wrong on this. So that's the existing formula. If you take the same tax year, we're not changing anything, but we're looking at the way the new formula would play based upon the same set of circumstances. And on the right column you go through there, now the new funding formula is $1.50. You've all committed to that memory, you know what that is. At $1.50 it gets to $1.3 billion. Your total levy maxes out at $1.9 million. It's considerably less than what you had on the old formula. The per student is $1,073. And because that's less than $1,500, the state will now make up the difference between the $1,073 and the $1,500. So now your local effort assistance is almost the same as what it is now. And I kept looking at this saying, something's got to be wrong. But just as a coincidence of numbers, you're within $50 of what your LEA is now. So when we're done with this, your levy and LEA, if you looked at the 2018 tax year and applied the new laws, would be $2.769 million. It's a considerable decrease of what you receive now. Okay? And that is what districts throughout the state are dealing with. Statewide, out of 295 districts, 20 districts potentially will have an increase on the new formula. The other 275 will see less local dollars. And that was intentional on the part of the legislature. And I think I have a slide to talk about that. Let's keep moving. I'm watching the clock and realizing I need to go. There's three pieces that go along with levies as well. The AAA is what I call them. First is the approval. I talked about that. Before you can assess, before you can put a levy to your taxpayers for ballot approval, starting in fall of 2018, you must go to OSPI with a plan and get their approval on how you're going to spend those money, how you plan on spending those monies. Okay? The second one is accountability. There's big changes in school accountability. Some of it is within the accounting structure itself that I shared with you. The other one is as far as going to OSPI. The third piece is just how they spend the money, the enrichment piece. And then the third piece is the auditing piece. Now, SAO is the auditor of all governmental entities generally, and they audit the school districts. Okay? But OSPI has specific mandate now to come out and audit the school district in the future to make sure the way you spend the money under the levy is consistent with whatever plan you put before OSPI. And that all of those activities meet whatever the final definition of enrichment activities are. It's nothing that they don't deal with already. They're constantly audited. They're very accountable. If they have problems, they end up on the front page of the paper if they're egregious, or they're simply there at the state auditor's office and look at the reports. So this is just another focused effort to make sure school districts are meeting the law and the legislative definition of what has to happen. But those are the 3 A's of levies. They come along with it. Funding formula salaries. Okay? So probably the biggest change that they do, and one of the more problematic things they do in 2242, is they simply, at some level, blow up the current funding system for salaries for all the staff units that the state funds. Under the, now I'm going to focus on teachers because that has been, that's a bigger class of employees, and that's where the real breakage occurred. Currently in the funding system, there's something called staff mix. And staff mix is a number between 1, 5 decimal places out, and almost 2, that attempts to capture the experience level of the staff you hire in the district. If you have brand new teachers with absolutely no experience and just a bachelor's degree, they're a 1.0, and roughly they get about $35,000 in the state formula. And as teachers grow, if you get to PhD in 15 years, they'll get almost double that amount of money in state funding. And each district has an aggregate of all their staff mushed together to come up with a staff mix factor, which might be something like 1.55482, or something like that.
1.59.
Okay. You don't know this. But I'll tell you something to be proud about with that number. That means that your overall experience in your staff is higher than the state average. You have more experienced qualified teachers than most districts in the state. And that's something to be proud of. But it also means, if you take that 35,000 times the 1.59, that's roughly, and I'm making numbers up, these are precise, that's roughly what you're going to get for each identified teacher in the funding formula, okay? And it's a beautiful model because the districts get paid for the actual staff they hired, and they don't have to play cost games of saying, do I hire the cheap teacher or the really experienced teacher, which is a regular dynamic when you leave Washington State and other states. And this is the part where I want to play the last sequence of Planet of the Apes, where the Statue of Liberty is in the sand, and if you know it, you know what he says. They blew the damn thing up. And that's what they did, okay? That was probably the most equitable piece of the basic ed funding formula, and they got rid of it. And there are many, many folks in the state that are paying, especially if they're above average, as you are. If you're below average, you may not be so worried about it yet. So as we go through on the state salary allocations, they created new allocation levels, and they're fixed amounts generally. So for the teachers, their final goal at some point will be $64,000 per formula staff teacher. It doesn't drive what they get paid, it's just an average funding amount. And they will say that that's based on the average salary being paid today to teachers in the state. Okay? When you talk about the CAS and CLS, there's other values, we'll go over that in a minute. And then they allow for some other things. One of them is if you have teachers or ESAs that focus on STEM, transitional, bilingual, special ed, etc., they're allowed to get up to 10% additional for some of the salaries, but there's no state funding for it. It has to come from that $64,000. So it's a little problematic. Just to go through a table. So this attempts to give you an idea of where we are based on last year's reporting, where we were in last year's formula, and where we will eventually be by 1920. If you go across the top, in 1617, the state on average was paying $54,000 in the funding. And I stress funding. This has no correlation to what they were paid necessarily. It's what they were funded at. For teachers, on the classified side, they were getting $33,000 and change, and the administrative side, they were getting roughly $62,000 per administrator. As you go across, the 1617 is the reported average cost that the districts reported to OSPI. If you're familiar with this, everybody who has a contract as of October 1 is reported to OSPI on something called the S-275. And that captures all of their compensation for the year. It's not perfect, but it's the best data set we have up there. So as you go through, in 1617, you can see teachers are being paid $65,000 on average, classified were 45, administrative were 118, and these are state averages. Each one of these numbers are going to vary widely by district, and certainly by experience level. Okay? And then when you look at the 1920, the new funding formula under 2242 attempts to fully fund the average, but you can kind of see that they didn't quite do it well. They came closest on teachers. They focused on funding 64,000, and starting in the 18-19 year forward, I believe there's an inflator, so this will actually be a little bit higher. They will increase over 2 years, so this district will not be receiving this 64,000 in full until 1920. When you talk about classified staff, they're funding them at about 45,912, probably one of the more successful ones. And on the administrative side, they didn't even come close, because they're funding at about 95, yet the cost out there is about 119 on average, and certainly widely varies among districts there. So this was the change to the salary schedule. We got rid of a responsive salary funding model that focused on the experience level that teachers were hired, and allowed districts to make the best decisions on the best qualified teachers they could get. And now we're moving into a costing model in which they're going to have to worry about the balance sheet, so to speak, as they staff up and hire. And in other states, we've seen changes when states have thrown this type of model out, where cost became an issue. And that's a horrible way to run a district when you're hiring people to serve kids. Moving forward. So just at an aggregate level, one of the other pieces I did, because people want to know, what does this mean to me? Okay. Looking at the June 2017 state funding reports for Eatonville, you were funded in basic ed programs only. You were funded just under 85 staff units, FTEs, for instructional staff. you had just under 7 administrative staff, and you had just about 29 classified staff. And on the left column was the aggregate amount of funding that Eatonville received for those formula staff units. As we go forward and we roll through the new funding factors, the 64, etc., and we look forward to the 1920 year, without any inflators added to this and the same number of staff units, the right column projects what the new funding would be for Eatonville towards those staff units. So you can see between the two, there'll be about a $1.2 million increase. And this was part of the legislative vision, is they were taking levy dollars away and they intended to fully fund salaries. And that full funding was going to replace the loss of levy dollars. In some districts, it worked beautifully. In some districts, they actually made money on the deal, maybe. In other districts, it wasn't a fair trade. Okay. So this is a static model. This is not necessarily what's going to happen by 1920. It's just a way of starting with a familiar spot and projecting out what happens in the next 2 years under this new funding formula. As your enrollment increases, you'll get more staff units, whatever, whatever. It's simply a static view of that. So just an overview, because the instructional staff is so important to what we do in districts. I mean, without them, what's the point, honestly? The legislature really focused a lot on the instructional staff and what they did there. And this table just kind of provides a kind of a 4-year look at it and how this rolls out. So the left column looks at the 16-17 year last year as far as what the minimum salary for a teacher could be, and that was $35,700. It looks at the funded average, which is $54,943. It looks at the maximum, which is $67,288, and I believe that was just a salary schedule difference. And it had no provision at all for specialty teachers. When you go forward to 17-18, it's largely the same. It's inflated a little bit. I think it's a 2.3% increase for COLA. But beyond that, the world stays basically the same. When you get to the 18-19 year, though, we start changing things. 18-19 is a transition year because they blew up the salary schedule, the state salary schedule, and they got rid of the staff mix factor. 18-19 is a transition year. And the only thing I can do is interpret it. They thought it was a calming year, and they took some of the standards away for a moment. And they took away the minimum salary. The funded average is their halfway stepping point to get to $64,000 eventually on the funding side. The maximum salary, there's no maximum salary for 18-19 for instructional staff, and there's no specialty salaries yet. When you get to 1920 and 2021, they've now established a minimum salary for teachers of $40,000, and that would be a brand new teacher, BA, no experience. Okay. As you go down the funded average, this will be the funded average. It's really not an average. It is the number, $64,000 per formula staff unit. When you get to the maximum, they put a maximum in there of $90,000. Teachers can't be paid more than $90,000. But there's other pieces that will add to that, because when you look at the specialty piece, if you are a math science teacher, special education, bilingual, some other areas, you can, if your bargaining group agrees to this, you can get up to 10% additional on top of the $90,000. Okay, and that's largely what happens in 2021. This is the way it rolls out over the period of 2242, and effective 1920. Excuse me, I had the wrong date earlier. These amounts will be increased by an IPD, which is a more modest factor than the Seattle CPI. Okay, and the 17-18 is certainly just what's funded as of the apportionment reports in September. This will be dynamic during the year as staff mix changes during the year and could go higher or lower by the end of the year. Okay. Salary allocations, regionalization. So one of the things that happened is they introduced a regional factor because they realized that salaries throughout the state are very different, whether you're in Everett or Wichita or Star or wherever, whatever district you're in, there's a different salary structure, there's a different market basis for your salaries. And in their attempt to address this, they created something called the regional factor. So when we talk about $64,000, the eventual funding level, there'll be, and the other pieces as well for administrative and classified staff, those will be increased for districts that have a regional factor above 1. And those factors break down as 6, 12, 18, and then there's a temporary one of 24% that eventually will roll back to 18. So if you were at 64%, and if Eatonville had a 6% premium, you would get 64 plus 6%, or roughly another $3,700 or so on top of that, and that would be your state funding. Okay. These factors were based upon looking at the pricing the costing of single-family residences within your districts and 15 miles around your borders. Okay? Rather creative way to do it. Didn't know they had the data to do that. So what does that mean for Eatonville? What I did is I shared Pierce County, because I think that one of the, well-intentioned as it was, one of the breaking points is you have neighbors that are competing for the same teachers that are getting different funding. So it kind of becomes a little bit of an IQ test at some level. Do I go to Tacoma or do I go to Bethel? Unless they can locally negotiate equal salaries, and that's going to be difficult sometimes. So when you look through Pierce County, you'll see that all of the areas in Pierce County have some level of regionalization, except for Bethel and Eatonville. Okay? And this is not uncommon. When I look at Thurston County, only one district has a regionalization factor, and that's North Thurston. Yet they're competing for the same teachers as Olympia and Tumwater. So this is probably one of the real screaming parts that will come up this session. Who knows what will change, but I think districts throughout the state are very incensed that they are being put at a disadvantage to neighboring districts when they're truly competing and marketing to the same teacher groups. And it takes away any equity factor, truly. Keep it going. Employee contracts. So we talked about it, levy funds can only be used for enrichment beyond basic education. And when you're negotiating, the great question is, what's enrichment? Well, we don't know yet. But it's those activities that are beyond basic education. What does that mean? We're still trying to figure out what that means. Whether OSPI will come up with rules that are very detailed and force us through a decision tree, or whether they'll simply do something very broad that allows a lot of discretion locally. But until those rules are out, we're shooting in the dark as far as what that may be. And I have my opinions, and everybody else has their opinions, but honestly, that's all they are right now. Okay? Supplemental hourly pay rate may not exceed the employee's basic hourly rate. So if you're getting paid for an additional day, the rate for those 8 hours, 7 hours, whatever that day may be defined by your district, can't be different, can't be higher than what's in your base contract. It's going to require configuring. You know, it's not an insurmountable block. Collective bargaining agreements currently in place are not impaired. So if you have a collective bargaining agreement going forward and the law provides for something different than what you have already negotiated, you're in safe territory. However, if you're bargaining now, you have to worry about what the limitations are placed on in the future. And beginning September 1st, 2017, districts must annually report to OSPI on tribe contracts. We don't know what that reporting will look like, but you can expect quite a bit of detail as far as what those contracts are for and how they're being paid. Health benefits, very quickly, I'm running out of time here. Currently, you negotiate health benefits with the district. You may be through the WA plan, you may be through Primera, you may be through whoever. PEB. You're PEB? Oh, you just, okay. So I'm on PEB, I think it's a great plan. The transition for Eatonville hopefully won't be too bad because you're going to be moved to something called SEB. The state is creative, Public Employees Benefit Board, School Employees Benefit Board. It's brilliant. But they haven't defined what this is. They just finally named the members that are going to be on this benefit board. And you can expect that it's going to be a lot like PEB. But we don't know until this board does their work. And that's effective for January 1st, 2020. And they also limit districts' ability to provide health benefits beyond PEB. I think I covered that. So what do you need to know? This is a lot of change. And as citizenry in the district, and facing citizenry in the district, they've had a lot of information because the legislature is very proud. 7.3. Everybody has heard that message if they paid attention to the meeting. They've heard the legislature talk about how much they increased teacher salaries. A falsehood. They did not do that. They increased the funding for teacher salaries while they reduced local levies. So it's a balancing point that has to be dealt with there. So there's a lot of issues you've got to deal with. And just kind of go through some of these things quickly. I'm going to start with the viewpoints. I referenced this earlier. There's a lot of spreadsheets out there. There's my spreadsheet. There's, I'm sure WA has a spreadsheet. OSPI has a spreadsheet. Many of my peers throughout the state have done spreadsheets projecting different aspects of this. And I'll tell you, lately, they're all correct. But they all have different sets of assumption on what that future looks like. And if you're relying on them as a board, as a superintendent, as members of the community or bargaining groups, you need to understand what are in those spreadsheets because they're projecting growth in student enrollment, that may or may not happen. They're projecting changes in assessed valuations. They're projecting inflators. Who knows what inflation is going to be 2 years from now? I can take a guess and most times be right, but I may not be. So they're kind of built on a whole cloud of assumptions. They're good, solid work, but if you're going to rely on them, you need to understand what's in those and decide whether that meets what your expectations are as a consumer of that data. And you have a legislative viewpoint. They certainly have their spreadsheets. You have the union that's looking at different data sets. You have the community that's dealing with the media and what's on the radio, the papers, whatever shows up at their house, as well as a tax bill that's going to show an increase in the spring. And you have the district that has to figure out what does this mean to us. So I think I've covered most of that. And the last comment is that we can expect changes will be made in the spring. As much as the legislature says, we're doing one session, we're not doing overtime this time, we don't want to deal with any policy issues, and the bank is closed, we're not putting any more money into it. That's a great starting point, but they will have a lot of pressure to change some things. So you can expect that some changes will happen this next session, 2 years out, 3 years out, and that you have to stay in the conversation, understand what impact that will have on Eatonville. Projections, I've covered that. Initial questions. So the first question you should be saying is, how would the new Enrichment Levy impact your local LEA revenues? I gave you one viewpoint of that, which is a static recasting of the 2018 levy. But you'll want to look at the next 2 or 3 years out based upon the assumptions you think are appropriate for your district. How much new state funding will offset the levy LEA loss, the salary funding? You may have money coming into categorical programs that might relieve local money if you were already subsidizing them. But if you weren't putting local money into your categorical programs, these are all new expenses, and they actually will require you to find more local money to subsidize the state funding for supplemental contracts. So it's a very nuanced viewpoint that every district has to do, and nobody at the state level can do this for them, in spite of what's out there. How much are you paying for local dollars for additional compensation and costs for the state-funded positions program? So state-funded positions, how much extra are you paying in supplemental contracts? The next one, what are the costs and FTE of your non-state funded positions? Okay, so you have to worry about the federal piece, maybe. You also have to worry about the local discretionary positions that you choose to hire beyond the funding formula, and understanding what your costs are from local dollars are going into there to fund those. Okay? And then what are the additional costs of the categorical program expansion to be paid from the enrichment levies? I hire a teacher in CTE, I may have to put $6,000 or $7,000 additional money beyond the base salary. So where's that money going to come from? It's a very complex view, and every district has to do this work. Communication issues. So you're not doing the levy in February.
We are doing it.
Oh, you're doing the levy in February? My mistake. So you're faced with, you got $7.3 billion. What are you calling me for? Some version of that argument, because that was the front page on July 1st. And that is the news that's coming from many of your legislators in the emails that are showing up in all my emails, okay, talking what a great job they did. That's a messaging you have to work with, and you have to explain what the 7.3 is and isn't. You're going to have to, so you have a huge increase. You're going to have to address your continued need for levy, because they're hearing you've got so much money, schools are fully funded, I got no taxes for schools anymore. Well, that's not true. And you can go through a number of different areas in your school and say, the state doesn't pay for these. They don't pay for extracurricular. They don't pay for additional days beyond 180. They don't pay for the professional training days you may have. They don't pay the supplemental contracts. And the list goes on, and every district has their own about why they need levies. And they're still underfunding in spite of what they say. And then you have to talk about the new restricted nature of local levies, if that impacts how you've spent them in the past. And that's a tough conversation. Hopefully by February we have more definition as to whether that will impact your usage of them, or whether we're just reshuffling the deck chairs, so to speak. Questions? You've been very kind. You have questions all along. Come on, somebody's got to have a question.
So, Cal, can I have
Yes.
a clarification?
Sure.
So currently, right now, just let's put this into simple.
Okay.
If I hire a teacher who happens to have 20 years experience and a master's degree, then the state gives me that amount of money, because there's a grid, and that person lives on a grid, and then that's what the state gives me, correct? So in this new funding system, I get an average. If I hire this person, who would be probably above the average, then that's gonna have to be balanced with another person that is below the average, correct?
If you're trying to balance a salary schedule, whatever that's defined and negotiated on in the future, your balancing point of that schedule has to be $64,000 with state money, potentially.
Correct.
And then your supplemental contracts become enrichment activities to be negotiated.
So one thing that I think maybe the public didn't understand is that now with the new, we negotiate individually in this district, and then Yelm, they do their own negotiations. So we're all private contractors now with no grid, correct?
There is a grid now, currently in the real
Correct.
world today.
Yes.
So there is a state salary schedule, but it's voluntary. But the reality is because there's certain points you have to hit and certain averages you have to hit on a salary schedule according to law, it is extremely problematic to negotiate your salary schedule. So with the exception, last I knew, 6 districts, 289 districts said forget it. We're adopting the state salary schedule and we'll negotiate around supplemental salaries. Now in the future, the state says, we're done, no more salary schedule. OSPI will come out with a suggested one in December 1st, which is again optional, but it's going to be very problematic to do this because your funding no longer responds to the growth of a teacher's career and their time in the profession. They're getting $64,000 as a brand new teacher, if they're the only teacher in the district, and 20 years later, they're going to get $64,000 funding, plus whatever inflation is in there, regardless of all the experience they gained over that time. So in negotiating a salary schedule, it's going to become very problematic. And I suggest all districts, and I would say the same to anybody bargaining, if you get to the point of bargaining a salary schedule, you have to stress test that for at least 5 years to ensure that the money is there to deal with all the step increases of teachers over those 5 years. Assuming that over time you'll have enough turnover, so but in some districts it could be a longer viewpoint they need to look. Is that more fully answered?
I just wanted that clarified.
Okay. Yes.
Maybe another clarifying question. So we're a small school district, and you're saying that you will be funded at 23 students per class. Let's say we have a calculus class that really we only have a demand for 15 students. How does that impact our funding for that class?
It doesn't impact your funding at all.
So we won't.
Your issue may be that 23 generates, I'll make numbers up, 12 teachers in the high school, but because you have a couple classes that have to be smaller, a language class, a calculus class, whatever, marine biology, whatever you're offering, you may find that you have to hire 14 teachers. Those additional 2 teachers will be funded out of your levy, and they would be presumably very clear enrichment activities that would be allowed. Is that help?
Right. So
Okay.
basically, if we can't fully fill a room,
Right.
it's costing us extra teachers that we have to hire just by virtue of the fact that we live in a rural community.
Right.
That's a detriment to us.
Yes. And many times, I mean, you want to give more to your kids. You want to have a more robust program than the basic ed program required. And your community demands it. So you're going to be faced with that constantly balancing this thing. So on an average basis, it may turn out that the English class is 30. Not because you want the larger class, but because that's what you get to put in that class. And you may balance that off with another class of 23. And you're going to be subject to however you negotiate the compensation around that.
So there won't be a penalty for having more than 23 students in a class? Because I thought I heard that that was a piece at one point.
There isn't. It was
K3, K3,
in
okay.
K3, yes.
Not at the high school.
Not beyond there. Yes. Thank you. Other questions? Yes.
So in referencing slide 5, and, I believe you said that K-3 class sizes will be funded,
Yes.
17-to-1 ratio.
Yes.
Will they also allocate funding for building those new classrooms?
You already know the answer to that. No, in fact, the capital budget was not passed even. So we have many districts right now who have broken ground, have contractor on and waiting for state funding to go. Chehalis, I just heard the story today, had 2 elementary schools. They were going to open at the same time. One of them would have received state capital projects money. Because of the delay in this budget, they will be opening a year and a half different. So, yes, we'd like them to fund, but no. That's an idealized view of where they should be. And that might be the next round of lawsuits against the state. How can you fully fund basic education if you aren't paying for the classrooms? So, good question, thank you. Anything else?
So you've got the initial questions for each district to address.
And they're just suggestions.
Would those questions also be the same ones that you would want to share with our elected legislators? And/or are there other strategies you would suggest as far as communicating with them in order to kind of talk the party line between all the districts statewide, but
Well,
specific to our issues?
probably one of the problems we're having with this legislation is there are winners and losers throughout the state on this. Okay, if I lose $2 million in levy, but my salary increases are $5 million, I've got some room to work. If things are reversed, I have a problem, okay? So the problem is that there's not a consistent message we can get for districts generally, but I'll share one of the smartest people I know. I was talking today around this area, and she has completely thrown up her hands about talking to the legislature about changes required, and she's focusing more on what the impact to my district was. And she's just trying to do that message, because they can't necessarily deny the impact. They need to understand what the pain is for that district, and that's not necessarily what her neighbors had, it's what her district had. And that's the messaging that I think districts are better served sometimes by. Does that make sense? Does that answer that? Okay, thank you.
So if I look on page 8, at the levy comparison on the difference between our existing levy now
Yes.
and our new formula, I come up with approximately $3 million less. And if I look at the salary increases on page 11, slide 21,
Right.
I come up with $1.2 million more.
Yes?
So if I subtract 1.2 million from 3,
You're down.
Yes?
that's a lot of money.
Now, this viewpoint of looking at this is not well loved by certain groups. Okay, I believe they called it the ESD myth. I was happy they didn't call it Cal's crud, something like that. It's a static viewpoint. The world will exist, it will go on, it will have many, many influences in the future, so you probably never want to match those numbers. But in a static world with no changes, that's exactly the picture you'd have.
So no changes would mean basically the same enrollment,
Same
Of
enrollment,
children.
same assessed valuation.
same assessed evaluation.
Yes. Now, you maybe will benefit as your assessed valuations go up. You maybe will benefit more as your enrollment goes up. And there's some projections that show that. And if you're comfortable with those projections and you want to base your business model on that, that's your purview. But you need to understand what those projections are and check in on those. And the reason I say that is some of those projections, when you talk about projecting out assessed valuations for 295 districts, okay? Let's just focus on Pierce County for a minute. I don't know how many there are. Let's say there's 12 districts here.
15.
They're using a county average increase in assessed valuation applying against all districts. But I can guarantee you, Tacoma will not increase at the same level Eatonville will, or Carbonado, or some of these more rural districts. So when they do their assessed valuations, they're using an average. That may not be appropriate for Eatonville. In one case, in another county, I was doing a projection for a district, that district actually had experienced decline over the past 7 years, while their neighbors, waterfront property, had an increase. So the county average, of course, went up, but that was not their experience. And that was an invalid basis for them. But that's the nature of doing big, broad projections, is you make assumptions. And you don't always have the data at the granular level you need. Does that help?
Mhm.
Okay. Yes.
But to add real numbers to what she's saying, that's about 1.8 million.
Yes.
I
Right.
think my math is right.
That is correct.
It will be short.
So there'll be 1.8 reduction in discretionary money. And because of this type of analysis, OSPI has changed their projections to start breaking it out between discretionary and non-discretionary money for districts, because that's an important piece about looking at funding. I keep trying to find a cheesy analogy to explain this, but I'll keep it simple. If I don't have enough for a steak and potatoes dinner, and I beg you for more money, you said, here's money, but buy dessert. You didn't solve my problem, but I have more money. And that's a little bit of what the legislature did here. I have more money, I should be okay, but I have to buy more with the money you gave me. Yeah. Maybe not the best analogy, but I'm working on this, okay? Yes.
I have a rudimentary understanding of levies, and I understand that they are voted on by a majority of 60%.
Just a simple majority.
Just a simple
Simple
one?
majority.
Yeah, okay. And they have an expiration.
They can go up to 4 years.
So, our levy is still coming in, and the state has just decided to take that money that our voters have already approved, and they have decided to sweep it away into their formula.
Well, you can think of it that way, but I wouldn't say it that way. So what the state did is they put a new tax out there,
Yeah.
81 cents. And then they said, on your local taxes, you're now going to be capped at $1.50 per thousand. That's the maximum, I believe was $3.46 on the slide,
Yeah.
was your tax rate. So for Eatonville, you get to collect $2 less per thousand from your taxpayers.
So our
In
taxpayers
spite
have
of the fact that
already
you voted
approved
and they said,
that-
please take our money.
Yes.
Yes, yes.
And so now their money is being given back to them.
It's never collected, yeah, you're
It
stopped.
was just never
Yeah.
not collected.
Yeah. I would say the size of your bucket that you could fill with
Right.
money is now much smaller.
Right,
Yeah,
okay.
okay. Thank you for that.
I brought my pitchfork just in case.
So,
I
Cal,
can you run as fast as I can? Yes.
so Cal, just to clarify, our taxpayers will see a decrease
Probably not
with
staying on camera
state,
tonight.
with state plus the $1.50.
In 2018, your taxpayers will see some version of the 81 cents increase, and it'll probably be higher than that. I don't know what there's an indicated ratio that would be adjusted against that. In 2019, the 81 cents stays in place forevermore, unless they adjust it, and your tax rate will go from $3.46 down to $1.50 maximum, unless they change something.
Right. So, I mean, I'm adding that up, if we stayed at 81, that would be $2.31 per 1,000
Okay?
for taxpayers, or somewhere in
Yes.
there. Whereas currently they're at 3.50.
And there will be a lot of conversation this spring about changing that formula. And some of the ideas are let everybody go up to $2,500 regardless of the tax rate. The larger districts like Seattle are saying, why are you limiting us to $2,500? Let us go up to $1.50. And everybody has their own argument that serves them or peers like them. And it'll be interesting to see whether the legislature does anything. On the other side, assessed valuations have gone up. And some of the legislators are saying, we don't need 81 cents, we only need 70 cents, or whatever it calculates to generate the dollars they expected. So there's some arguments about lowering the 81 cents. So hang on for a fun ride and a really intense conversation.
So one last thing, so Kim Knight, I just want to introduce her. She is our new business manager, and she's new at the role, so.
Be gentle.
So could you so what is our total budget? Everything all in? Can you just clarify that? 20?
Our total
Four.
actual money budget is approximately 23 million.
Okay. So I just wanted that clarified.
Yes?
So this all goes into effect over a series of years, correct?
Correct.
So our levy is up, we go for one in February. Do we have to, we are following these rules now as we move before?
So when you go in, I'll lay it out. So when you go in February, the first collection year you're gonna have, and taxes are on a calendar year, your first collection year will be 2019.
Okay.
In 2019, you're now subject to the $1.50 per thousand limitation, 2,500 maximum per student, which is academic for you right now. You don't have to do, I'll get everybody saying this yet, the mother may I to OSPI to give them a plan ahead of time saying, this is how we plan to spend the money, can we collect it? So you have kind of a free pass on this February, but you are now subject to $1.50 to the future. And the interesting piece is, and I say this, you may kick me, but districts are struggling to understand what they should be going for right now, because we don't know what changes the legislature may make. Maybe the legislature will come back and say, you can go up to $2,500. We don't care about the rate anymore. Well, if you go for $1.50, Eatonville is going to be still seeing a big reduction. So they may choose to go for $2,500 per student, knowing that that may be more than they can collect in the current law, but being unsure of what changes may happen in the legislature. So among districts, you may see numbers that don't correlate with $1.50. If the law doesn't change, as a taxpayer, you are protected. They will not collect more than $1.50. But if something else happens out there in legislation, this would allow the district to potentially get back to a pre-22-42 level and continue funding adequately their schools. Does that make sense? Okay. And that's a conversation that's very robust. I think you guys are now the maybe 10th group I've talked to about this, or 10th superintendent, and I know my peers throughout the state are just starting that message. So thank you for that question.
I have another comment, sorry,
Okay.
sorry, Roger. I think also that we didn't take into account the lower size beginning 2018, 2019, for K through, third grade levels.
Right.
So what that means then is that additional staff, because you're gonna have now lower size.
Yes.
And also the classrooms.
Right.
And the infrastructure for those classrooms. Did they,
They didn't do anything for infrastructure, but I want to be clear, when they talk about 17-to-1 ratio, I'd love to say that every classroom, on average at least, because I know they don't come in neat little packages, have 17 kids. But the reality is, historically, how that has been measured is not necessarily just the teacher in the classroom, but it might be floating teachers, specialists. So maybe an aggregation that the actual classroom might be 19 or 20-to-1, but you have all those teachers serving those kids in K-3 that would average a student to staff ratio of 17-to-1. It's a little wonky, but it's part of what the legislature does to school districts, is they set up these expectations as if every school is perfect and the kids come in nice little 17 packs. And that's not the way life works. Yeah. Yes? Am I okay on time? I'm over?
Go ahead.
Okay.
So even if we fund the levy at $1.50 per student and it leaves us short,
Yes.
where do we go from there? That's a really good question.
That's a great question. I can answer that. I think the folks at the front of the room with Preston and Kim, you're going to have to figure out, looking forward, what's the money we have.
So
and
we
how-
asked everybody in
how
our
we get it.
district to fund to the max level, and they still aren't gonna get,
the same level they did historically. Correct.
good
So
luck selling that one.
the idea is, and I have no idea what Eatonville is going to do, so this is Cal Brodie, throw the apples at me, leave them alone. Okay. You're going to look at any staff you hire from local levy dollars and determine whether you're going to continue those staff. That is one way you're going to cut your budget, whether it be classified, administrative, or teachers. Okay. You're going to look for cost reductions that you can find, and sometimes you take the long-term approach and look at efficiencies you may gain through lighting changes, heating changes, whatever, if that even applies to your district. You're going to work with the teachers and see what you can do around negotiations. That's always a fertile ground and very difficult one to have, and largely doesn't tend to be successful. But somehow they'll have to squeeze that to take Eatonville School District and fit it into a smaller bucket of funding.
So, we're parents,
Okay?
not involved with the school at all.
Okay.
But the reason why we moved out here was to have a different type of education for our kids and have a different type of community.
Okay.
And basically what the state has just done is thrown that all out the window for us.
If I were counseling you as a friend, I would say, realize all the districts are dealing with this one, okay? So if we're taking the level of education generally in the state from here and taking it down a notch, Eatonville will still probably be a quality school district above and beyond its peers. The very things you were looking at, but they're gonna struggle with more finances to hold that standard for you as a community. I don't think Eatonville is gonna go down the tubes as a district. You may see some bigger districts that have more difficulties, but it'll be a realignment. I can expect that the legislature will make changes to this. I just don't know what they are. But parent voices to the legislature are extremely powerful. They like listening to you a lot more than me and Creston. Yeah.
Yeah, hey, Cal, to speak to that a little bit, Greg, that's one of my big worries. We talk a lot about,
Take care of it.
yeah, about, teachers and salaries and all this stuff and benefits. But, under the new numbers, when we're gonna have a $1.9 million levy instead of a $4.5 million levy, what really is not coming up is that due to state laws, federal regulations, yada, 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 and the levels we're funded at, we spend about $400,000 more than we're funded for transportation, about $350,000 more than we're funded for school lunch programs, $500,000 less than we're funded for special ed. Right there, that's $1.25 million. And if we're stuck with a $1.9 million levy, that's what I'm worried about, what's gonna now happen to all the things we do that make Eatonville special. you know, like our Hands on Horses program, our credit retrieval center, there's dozens of amazing things that
And
I don't want to lose.
And I just want to caution, the numbers there are a relative type of thing. The future's going to happen. As more kids come into this district, Eatonville will see more funding for those kids. So if your enrollment grows, that will help deal with that. If the assessed valuation of your property goes up, and we're seeing, at least Pierce County in general, some very large increases in property value as Pierce County is now becoming more and more commutable county for Seattle. So there's other things that could negate those losses that are futuristic events that you don't know whether they're going to happen or not. You may have some sense of what's happening. If you have a housing development you build, you can take a guess. You're going to get more students from there. But I don't know what's happening in your community and what you can look forward to. So that's some of the issues. So I should be looking at Preston and saying, yeah, no, you're barking up the wrong tree. Assessed valuations may be going up, I would assume. No?
Enrollment is not going up here.
Are property values going up?
It's like 1%.
The biggest
Okay.
problem
Then
is
there's the
with
ARS
us and with
thing.
Bethel School District is that we deal with growth management and the ARO,
Yes.
but the growth management really, it hit us the amount of growth.
I always
we're-
know Bethel deals with it.
And water rights. So we have a trifecta.
And over half of our land is state and federal forest that we do not get any assessment value for. Good question.
I have a question, and I've heard in the media too that, as a parent that has a special education child, the funding for special education will be impacted. So will districts actually, in general, not encourage special education students to come into their district by maybe not hiring good teachers? Because I think when parents are shopping for a school district like we did, I think special education parents shop even a little harder. And so because they're looking for that unique fit for their unique child. So I'm just curious, if you, in your opinion, you think there's less of a draw from all districts?
I'll take a shot, but if you want to.
Draw special education students to the district because it costs more.
Well, currently, Tina, we are not at the max, and we would not be at 13%. Kristen's sitting right here, who is our special ed. We're at 10.5, and so I have not heard that.
Well,
What
I'm
we,
thinking general though, I'm not saying our district. but
Right.
I'm thinking, could that harm all districts looking at that and saying, we're gonna attract these kind of students because they can
Right.
actually bring in like our STEM students.
right, so,
Just like we wanna attract
right.
the football players.
I haven't heard that, Tina, so I'm not gonna speak on behalf of the other superintendents and or the school districts. But what I do know is that we do spend $500,000 right now out of our reserve, it has been in the last few years, to make up for the lack of state funding for special education. And so we know that we're getting a little back. I think we're at maybe 172,000, but you know, there's still this, so it'll go like this. But we, by law, will continue to spend that money. We have to. It's a federal compliance issue and it's the right thing to do for kids. So we have an open door policy and open hands. We want all children. And so, you know what? It doesn't matter. Labels don't matter here. So whether it's highly capable, special ed, you know, you name it, we want you. So we just know that our enrollment has not, you know, we're right around 2,000 and now under. We're about 1,800, 1,810. And that's really been pretty consistent for probably decades.
I'm just curious though, as a state, as a whole, I know our district has a great job in special education, but as a whole, is that gonna be, certain populations of students are gonna be more valuable to the district than others?
So I would just say as a state, if you look at OSPI Superintendent Chris Ragdolls, he has said that we need to be fully funding special education, period. And that has not been completed, or I would say adequate for our district, but if you read across, all the districts are saying the same thing. Just one more thing about like the prototypical school model, and this is very important, I know, to this board, and I think it's an important conversation because we have some parents here tonight that we don't typically necessarily have at all of our exciting board meetings. They are pretty fun. But so the state funds us 0.2 nurse, okay? So that's part of the prototypical school model. We would have a nurse one day a week, like maybe on Monday, we would have Heidi Mulcahy. Well, we have medically fragile children, we have a variety in our 1,800 and X students, and we know that we need a nurse each and every day, and that's the right thing to do. So that money, that's one example of what we fund out of our levy. We fund a nurse, and then we have a .2 RN to write the, to have the legality. And we know that that's the right thing to do because we need to, and even that, having 5 buildings with 1 nurse is woefully inadequate. So that, those are pieces that we do fund out of the levy that are important. Counselors, that's another one. So we are funded 1 counselor for all 3 of our elementaries. So that would be 1 person running back and forth, and so we fund that. And the board would be happy to talk about the mental health work that they have done and supported around counseling and how important it is. So we are facing some really challenging times, and we're looking forward to it because we are hopeful. We know that we have created a wonderful school district, and we have a wonderful board that supports kids, and we focus on children, and we have the right to have the right teachers here in place and to compensate them adequately, as well as our additional staff. So we will work hard together, but that is one of the reasons some of the staff that are sitting out here, we were inviting you to a levy committee conversation, because we really want all voices, because really it's a puzzle. We're gonna have to figure it out together, and we are here together, and we will be here together, and it's gonna come, and we will be here. But we also wanted people to understand the complexity and the difficulty, and it's very confusing, because if I had someone else up here, they would maybe give different numbers, but the bottom line for us is we know that we're not one of the winners, and I don't like that. We like to win. So thank you, Cal.
Cal, one more question for you.
The last question, do we do drum roll?
Okay, there's been some stuff in the media lately about some of the revenue projections being,
Yes.
shall I say, outstanding. And if that's the case, there's been talk about actually reducing property tax because of the UN outcry from folks.
The 81 cents, yes.
Yes. So I guess I'm just kind of wondering how in good conscience, this be an editorial response on your part here.
I'm not sure I need a
Is
response.
how in good faith can you have ample and adequate funding when obviously we're demonstrating and other districts have demonstrated shortages? We're already talking about turning money back.
I can't justify it. I mean, if you have to think from a legislative perspective, most of the state budgets, they can kind of say, here's your money and make it work. Okay, we talk about K-12 education, going back to the special ed comments in the back. This is the paramount duty of the state. There can only be one paramount duty of the state. And every kid who shows up in school district is entitled, has a legal entitlement to a full, adequate, basic ed and special education program. And this is different for the legislature. And they constantly struggle with the changes that we have in our workload, the students that show up, the changes that we have in our staffing, which historically has affected what they had to pay for salaries. And this is one of those areas that's so important that there's really no one number you can sit there and say, finally, we've hit it. Because there's always a kid that we need to be serving differently, or we need to serve more intently than we can under existing models. So we're somewhat insatiable about funding. I'll just be blunt. We are insatiable. You can't give us enough money to do the job right. We do the best we can with the funding we have every single day. The legislature struggles with that. They want to fit us into a nice box and say, here's your money, have a nice year. And many other states do that. Our state is unique because of our constitutional language. So some of our legislators are struggling with that concept of how do I limit my exposure to funding basic education? How do I get the court off my back? And all the political comments about the against the court and how dare they try to tell the legislature what to do. So it's an interesting world up there. I can tell you the entire legislature doesn't think that way, but the folks that are focusing on taxes feel that way. If we have an opportunity to lower taxes for taxpayers who what votes them in, they want to take that opportunity. And there's a seat in the 45th district right now that if it goes to Democrats, they will now have the majority, and that conversation may go away. Does that enough editorial comment on my part? We'll see, yeah.
So I'd like to make a statement, particularly for those of you who haven't been a part of this conversation, a part of kind of dealing with the financial, I want to say crisis, because it has been, as a board, I feel like we've been in crisis mode for a long time, and as administrators, trying to figure out how we can help serve students. But I really want to recognize that our representatives have been very congenial and willing to talk to us, and they care about the student base in this area, and they care about the taxpayers in this area. And all of the conversations that they've had with us, their decisions were really well intentioned. And now the conversation we need to have in a very positive way is, thank you for your concern and for really trying to help us as taxpayers, but this is the impact it's going to have on Eatonville. And they've been very open to hearing that message. Now what we need is for you to write that message so that they can forward that on to others. And making sure that you recognize that they have been at the table with us when other school districts are not being able to have the ear of their legislators. So please recognize that we have been very well supported. The impact is unfortunate and unintended. I know this is an unintended consequence. They're trying to help taxpayers out, but these are just, like you said, the devil is in the details.
Yes.
So write your legislators and let them know that this is a $1.8 million impact on our school when we've already been cutting and cutting and cutting as much as we can. And we do care about our students, and we know that they care about our students as well. So I want you to leave here on a positive note, knowing that we have legislators that care and are willing to listen. We just have to use our voice.
And if I can just modify the one thing, talk about a projected 1.8 impact to the discretionary funds the district has. Overall, you may get more money, but they're locked up in all the little lock boxes of categorical programs, and they're not available to supplement your levy loss, or supplant your levy loss. Thank you.
Between Kristen and Kim, I guess I'm curious, Jeff mentioned the shortages we already have with transportation, meals, and special ed. So we're talking about 1.2 million there, plus the shortage of 1.8 potentially on the levy. You combine the two of those, that's 3 million. I mean, so if we're writing letters, it'd be kind of nice to know what the party line is on a projection as far as the shortage. Is it 3 million? Is it 1.8? Something in between?
We could work out something.
It probably is somewhere in between,
Because we don't want to shoot for 1.8 when we know it's 3. Or it could be.
Well, we do know that those are encumbrances. Those are bills that we have already committed for children, transportation, special ed. I mean, those are,
Paying them out of existing dollars.
yes, we have. And that's
But
why
that
we've
ought to
been
be-
using some
That ought to be
reserves.
coming out of the state theoretically.
We would like the state to fully fund, yes. Yeah.
One more thing, 10 seconds. Cal mentioned it earlier, I cannot overstate how important your voices are to our legislators. I'm the legislative rep for the district, I work with these people all the time. Your voice, the voice of the people in this community carries a lot more weight than mine does and our board does. We're just people they work with, but they view you as voters, they listen to you, they care what you think. We're in the 2nd district, Senator Randy Becker, Representatives J.T. Wilcox, Andrew Barkus. You can go to the legislative website, get their contact info, email me, I'll get you all the info you want about them. They want to listen, they care, and it does matter. Get out and email these people. It's
Your
very
kids'
important.
voice as
Yes.
well. That's a huge impact
Yeah.
when they hear it from your kids. So,
That's it.
I believe the average is 8. If they hear from 8 people.
6.
6?
6 people gets
So,
them
I mean,
looking
if we
into
had
something.
100, that's,
That's off the
it's a
charts.
considerable.
yes.
It
And there's
doesn't take
not very many things
voices
they hear
to
from
put
100
that.
people.
Invite them out here and have a meeting.
So maybe some sort of form letter, some sort of forwarding email. It doesn't have to be 20 different individual messages. It could be the same exact message signed by each individual forwarding person. But if they get it 20 plus times, it would make the.
And if you need financial facts, we can only produce financial facts, but we can get those from Mr. Hawkes.
Definitely can have some talking points. And this will be available, Cal will be in infamy That will be on our YouTube site, and I'm sure that we will tweet it and put it out on our Facebook.
Yep, we're gonna cross our fingers that the recording quality's good.
Okay, all right. But any of you can share that with your constituents as well. And if there's some place that you would say, Creston, Kim, will you come here? We would be happy to do that, and then a board member or two. Or if if you just want the board members to come, that's fine. We will equip them with lots of information. That's fine. You can just have them as well. Yeah. All right.
Are there any other questions, while you're here and you have the opportunity?
It's a quick one. Have we ever invited them to come here and see what
We
would
did,
happen?
yes.
Many
Yeah.
times.
They've
We
been,
did for this event as well, but
Yeah.
we have a good relationship, and that really is a testament to this board. And we like each other, and so we are very supportive of our legislators and want them to understand, because we know that they care deeply about this community. So
Because sometimes if they could actually see what we won't have without that money.
we have met with them.
We sat down and
Yeah.
we had that conversation, and it was enlightening. I think that they saw things from a perspective that they weren't aware of, and they were very grateful for that opportunity.
Not many legislators are talking to anybody about this right now, but ours are talking to us. So that's another positive note.
They've been very gracious. Thank you all for coming. Please help others in the community understand the impacts that this has, because they're not going to understand when they say we're cutting your taxes and then we're going to be asking for more. So please keep that in mind. And with that, we'll adjourn this meeting.